it's critical. So we've got high, moderate, and low here, but we don't have a critical one. So this doesn't look like it really probably has anything, but it is tied to this, which is another wheel spinning indicator here that, hey, you know what, we probably got an exploit here with this thing, or at least something that we should try. And that OpenSSL is tied directly to this mod SSL, so we don't really have to research it. Now let's move on to Samba here, Samba 2.2.1a. Let's copy this and let's check for an exploit. So just as simple as doing this and saying exploit. And we've got a few here. We've got this Samba 2.2.8 remote code execution. We've got Samba 2.2.x remote buffer overflow. And we've got one down here, which I love to see. This is Rapid7. So let's go to Rapid7 first. Why do I like to see Rapid7? Well, Rapid7 makes Metasploit. So it looks like this exploit is called Samba trans2 open. And let's read a little bit about the description. So it says, this exploits the buffer overflow found in Samba versions 2.2.0 to 2.2.8. That meets our criteria. This particular module is capable of exploiting the flaw in x86 Linux systems, that's important to know, that do not have the no exec stack option set. Note, some older versions of Red Hat do not seem to be vulnerable since they apparently do not allow anonymous access to IPC. So remember, we did get anonymous access to IPC earlier when we connected to it via our SMB client. We never got access to admin. We could never do anything in IPC. We tried to say ls and it said denied, but we still logged in. So we do have anonymous access to IPC. That's interesting. And we are potentially running against an x86 Linux system, so that's interesting as well. It looks like we're potentially meeting some of the requirements here. Now, here is where this is great. You scroll down here and you see module options. And look, this is Metasploit. It gives you the module options. It says, hey, use exploit Linux Samba trans2 open. And then it tells you, hey, how to do this. And then you're good to go. That's really nice. I really like that. So I'm going to copy this one. And we'll just come to our notes and we'll say something like 139, potentially vulnerable to trans2 open. And we'll just paste a link here. And we can come read these as well. So this is the trans2 open overflow here. This looks like the manual version of the trans2 open overflow. It looks like it is a Perl script. And again, it looks like an overflow. So you'll learn to read these and see what they look like just over time. But you just want to look at the code, make sure everything's good to go. You will need to run this with Perl. It gives you the options here, trans to root Perl, what option to select, what target type to select, your IP address, and your target IP address. So we'll save this one as well. Why not? And we'll take a look at the other one, just see what it is. And it looks like it could work for us, remote root exploit for Samba 2.2.x that works against all Linux distributions. Samba.c. I think this is a possibility as well. So this is C code here. We're going to go ahead and just copy this. And we'll go ahead and add this to our list as well. And we'll figure it out. So all we're doing right now is the research. Okay, so from here, I've showed you the Google way. Let's say for some reason you want to do this on the fly, you want to use another tool, or you're in a network and the network has no access. You have no internet access out. You have no research capabilities. You can go to the terminal, and there's a great way to research this as well. So let's go back up to our notes and take a peek. Now let's take this Unix Samba 2.2.1a, for example. And let's do a tool called SearchSploit. Now SearchSploit is going to search for the exploit database, this whole database here that we're looking through. It's brought down onto your machine. Every time you update your machine and the database updates, it updates down your machine and all those exploits get downloaded for you already. But you could say SearchSploit, and maybe we search something like Samba 2.2.1a. Let's see what happens. No results. Well, okay. Why is that? Well, let's delete this. Now, you cannot be too specific with search exploit. The more specific you are, the worse off you are, because search exploit is searching the exact string that you are using. Now, you see that we search Samba, and it's searching for Samba and a 2. Okay, now we can start to see some things here. We see a Linux remote code execution right here, and we're gonna have to look through these. Now, it's not pretty, right? It's not the prettiest, but you see the trans2open does show up. Now, it's not the easiest way. I do prefer Google, but if you're in a pinch or you wanna look at all the different possibilities and see maybe, hey, is there a 2.2 in here? So like, look, Samba 2.2.0 to 2.2.8, OS X, that's not our operating system, but it's called trans2open. And we see that over and over and over again. So maybe the wheels spin again and it says, hey, trans2open, I think that that's potentially what we're looking for here. And then once we get down into the 3s, we know, hey, we've gone too far, this is not our version, etc. We could do the same thing with, let's say, the mod SSL, and we can say something like mod SSL2 if I type search exploit in front of it and do some searching there. And we can see, okay, there's denial of service, not it, 2.8.x, potentially, right? And then mod SSL 2.8.7. And another thing to look at over here, denial of service, remote. Remote is huge. Remote means remote code execution. So learning to read these as well. Exploit, check. Unix, okay, we're running on Linux, check. Remote code execution, check. And Apache mod SSL less than 2.8.7, check. So there's 3 different versions of this, and this is kind of why when I said earlier that, you know, they don't really work. One's been broken, they've rebuilt it. I just like the one off GitHub. So we'll play around with that one in just a little bit. But this is what you're doing. You're either going out to Google with the information that you find, or you're going to search exploit. You're just doing research. So now we've identified a couple potential vulnerabilities and we can go from there. So what I encourage you to do is just do some research on this Webalizer, do some research on OpenSSH, see what you can find out just for research's sake. Practice with search exploit, practice with Google, and then meet me in the next video. So what I want to do before we get into exploitation, I want to give you a quick sneak peek at what your notes should look like so far so you can see what good note keeping is. And this is in terms of an assessment, okay? Just in terms of an assessment. And then from there, we're going to practice with some other scanning tools just to get you familiar with other things than using just Nmap. And then finally, we'll move into our exploitation. So I will see you in the next video when we look quickly at our notes. Now looking at our assessment notes so far. So you can make this however you want to make it. Whatever makes sense for you is how you should do this. Now this is just a basic example of how I might take notes on an assessment. Now this is just one machine. You might be scanning against hundreds of machines sometimes, and that's okay. You just make the notes against the machines and what findings you have. So for example here, I've got this machine and it's all under this one tab. And we've got some Nmap results. And then on the Nmap results, we've got the different ports that I found open. I did leave off the RPCs, but we can see our Nmap full results here. We can see, okay, on 22, I found OpenSSH. On 80, here's some interesting items I may have had. You know, again, this is just from our notes. Looks familiar. And then I put in the Nikto scan under here. And on 139, I've got the Samba here. And this is just notes for us. Again, could anonymously connect to IPC with SMB client, but not admin. Your client is never going to see these. So make sure you make good notes for yourself, how you can understand it. And importantly, make sure that if somebody goes through here, they can also understand it, because sometimes somebody else might need to go through your report or through your notes, or somebody might be helping you write your report. And it's important to be clear and concise with what you're doing. Now I've got an exploitation tab here. We have not exploited anything yet, but I do have a findings tab here as well. So we've got a couple findings already. We've got this wonderful default test page, and it's hard to see because I've got it on my screen that's blown up, but you saw it once, and make sure that you have the IP address or the host name in your pictures. That's important. And then information disclosure here with the 404 page, and we've got the server header information disclosure. Now these are both taken in GreenShot, and a couple things to point out just for details. I've got borders added around these, and I've highlighted where exactly the finding is. Okay, so it's best to point out, because if these screenshots are going in a report, it's best to find out and just point out to the client exactly where it is, where they need to be looking. And again, make sure you have your identifier here if you can have it. And then here is a response from the website, and again with the information disclosure. So that's just a quick example of how your notes should start to form and how they should look. And then we'll do another one after the initial exploitation to kind of show how we exploited this machine and how we might take some notes for the client as well. And then you'll get to see this all over again in the sample report when we cover report writing towards the end of the course. So that's it, just a quick lesson just to make sure you're still keeping up with your notes. I'm going to harp on this throughout because it's very, very important. So I will catch you in the next videos, the next little mini chapter on some additional scanning tools, and we'll get right into exploitation. Now it's time to play around with Nessus. So when it comes to Nessus, Nessus is what is called a vulnerability scanner. You're going to use this quite frequently when you work as a penetration tester / ethical hacker. Basically, let's say you're doing an external assessment. Chances are that you're going to use Nessus in that assessment. Probably even right away, you might kick off your scans. Basically, you're going to send out an email saying, hey, scans are about to start. And then you're going to start your scans. And then you're going to let those scans run. And while you let those scans run, they take some time. You're going to go out and do your information gathering, maybe look for those breach credentials, try to find something juicy on the client. Then you'll come back and you'll review your scan results and see if there's anything interesting there. Same thing with internal. The process really doesn't change. We use Nessus quite a bit. So we're going to use Nessus here and just see what it looks like and how we can use it to our advantage. So let's go ahead and just go out to Google, and we're going to Google Nessus download. And we're going to go to downloads right here from Tenable. Actually, we'll download Nessus right here, sorry. And up at the top, we are looking for 64-bit Debian. So it says Ubuntu, but we're just looking for the Debian. So we're going to go ahead and just click on that and download it. We'll agree. We won't even read it. And we'll save here. And this will take a minute or so to download depending on your connection speed. So if you need to pause, go ahead and pause. Now we're going to open up a terminal, and I'll make this a little bit bigger. And I'm going to CD over to my downloads folder because that's where it is. And then we're going to say dpkg, which is dpackage. And we're going to install with a -i. And we're just going to say Nessus. There we go. Just tab if you have nothing in there. Capital N on the Nessus, and it should autocomplete. And then we'll hit enter. And it's going to grab the package and then start to download it here and install it. And you can see automatically it has been installed. So it says you can start Nessus Scanner by typing /etc init d Nessus d start. We're just going to copy that and paste it. And then we're going to navigate to this Kali 443-8834. I cannot talk. And then you're going to see your connection's not secure. We're just going to say advanced, add exception, confirm. And here's Nessus. Now this is going to compile plugins here. So this is going to take some time. Go ahead and let this finish. And when it does, go ahead and say, we're going to download or install Nessus Essentials. Okay, and then you're going to provide it with your name, and you need a valid email for an activation code. All right. Once your activation code has arrived via email, go ahead and just copy paste and then hit continue. And then it's going to ask you for a username. So I'm just going to say H Adams for me, and then I'll just do password 123 because you know I'm super secure. And I'm not going to save, and then now it's going to take a minute. So just go ahead and pause your video, let this install, go get a drink, go get some coffee, whatever it is that makes you happy. And once your Nessus is installed and you are at a login screen, go ahead and log in and then come back to the video and we'll start from there. Whew, that took forever. All right, so we have loaded Nessus, it's installed, and now we're brought to this blank screen that says My Scans. Why is it blank? Well, it's blank because we haven't made a scan yet. So let's go ahead and go up to New Scan. And let's quickly talk about what we're capable of doing. So this is the free edition of Nessus. This means that we can scan against any private IP address. And we can scan up to 16 of those, I do believe, at one time. So remember back to the networking section of your Class A through Class C. That's what we're capable of scanning here. If you were to try to go out and scan a website or an external host, not going to happen. So we do have a couple options here. We're going to start with this basic network scan, and then we'll talk a little bit about the advanced scan. So let's go ahead and click on this basic network here. And what we can do is we can just type in something like Chioptrix for the name. And then I just always copy this because you need a description. I just like to paste it in the description as well. And then down here, it's going to say, hey, what targets do you want to scan against? Well, we're only going to provide one IP address, and that is the IP of Chioptrix. And then let's go with the tabs here on the side. We've got the schedule tab. Schedule sounds exactly what it sounds like. It's scheduling. So let's say that you are into automation and you're working as a pen tester and it's a Monday morning at 8. Maybe you want to sleep in just a little bit longer. And you say, hey, you know what? I got to email a client. I'll schedule that. Email will go out at 8 o'clock. And then the email is going to say, hey, we're kicking off scans right now. And at 8:01, maybe your scan can kick off and you can schedule that to happen. And then you can wake up a little late. Pro tips there. Also, you can enable scanning for once, daily, weekly, monthly, yearly. So if you're in a business, you can do this on a periodic basis and get updated scan results. There's also notifications via SMTP if you have an SMTP server. Most importantly, discovery. So it's going to do port scan of common ports here. I actually like to do port scan of all ports. Again, this is the same thing as like a -P versus a -P-. You see the 1 through 65,535 here where we come down. Just common ports, I'm guessing top 1,000. So let's go down into assessment and we see scan type default. So we can scan default, we can scan for web vulnerabilities, we can scan for all web and all web complex. Let's just scan for known web vulnerabilities. If we go into complex, it's going to take a while. And this just depends on how deep into the scan you want to go. But we're just going to say for now, scan for known web vulnerabilities. And it'll show what it's going to do. It's going to do some page crawling, do some directory traversing, and look for vulnerabilities. Okay, on the report, it's going to say, hey, can we edit scan results? Yes, we can. Should we display hosts that respond to ping, display unreachable hosts? I just leave this as default most of the time. And then on the advanced tab, we have scan type. I just like to say default here. So we'll save this and then we'll go ahead and just launch it. And you'll see the wheel start spinning and now it means we're running, and this is going to take some time. So while this is going on, let's go ahead and hit new scan up here. And let's look at this as well. So we've got the advanced scan and they've got other scans here, which I don't use a lot of, but you might have used them in the past if you're familiar with Nessus, or they've got little one-offs, like they've got this shell shock detection, and it looks like they've got the shadow brokers detection here. So they've got a couple different scans, even a malware scan, but we're gonna go into advanced scan. These are the most common two you'll be using. Same deal here. And when we go into discovery, you see the discovery is a little bit different. So we've got host scanning, and it says, hey, do you want to ping the host? Or maybe you don't want to ping the host. And if we do ping the host, what are we looking for? Are we looking for ARP, TCP, ICMP, or UDP? What do we want to scan? Do we want to scan network printers? If we're doing an internal network assessment, maybe we want to click that. Maybe not, you know? And we can do a different types of scanning here. There's a lot more options, which is what advanced scanning is for. We could do port scanning. You see the SYN scan comes up again, aka stealth scanning. We could do UDP, and even down here it says it's really not possible for a UDP to pick up between open and filtered ports. So UDP scanning takes forever and it's not always reliable. We can do service discovery. I kind of just leave these blank or leave them as default. And then when we come through assessment, same thing. It just gives us additional options here. So it's always good to click through these. Do we want to brute force any logins? We could use Hydra to do brute forcing if we want. We could test for default accounts on if we could discover like an Oracle database, etc. But this is going to go through and try empty passwords, try log in as password, etc. So this just does a little bit more here. We can scan web applications and we can say, hey, we want to use a specific user agent, or we want to crawl from a certain web page. How many pages are we going to crawl? Again, it just gives us more control. So if we come down here, reporting looks the same, and then advanced, we have a little bit of more options here as well. But again, either way, if you use the advanced scan, I would start with the basic scan just as a beginner and then kind of play around with the advanced scan and see if you can scan against the same host and maybe get back more information. And maybe Keyoptrix is a good one to play with. But let's go ahead and go over to credentials. And now if you had credentials for a machine and you wanted to like log into that machine via SSH or Windows or even SNMP, you could enter in credentials and you could scan a little bit deeper on the machine, but you're likely never going to get that as a pen tester because you usually don't have any access. So let's go back to our scans, and you see now that it's scanning and running. The nice thing is that it does update vulnerabilities as it finds them, and it is finding them. We're actually at 99% right now. So you can click in it and you can see that it's got all different kind of vulnerabilities, and right now they're kind of grouped. So we won't worry about them too much. We're going to ungroup this once it's done. So I tell you what, go ahead and let your scan finish. Once your scan's finished, I'm going to meet you over in the next video, which is going to be part 2, where we're going to look at the scan results, talk about them a little bit, and see what Nessus can do for us. Now on to part 2. Our scan results are done, and we can tell because we've got a nice check mark here that says complete. So we're just going to click into our scan results, and looking at the overview, we can see here that we've got 5 critical, 38 highs, 59 mediums, 10 lows, and 67 informational. So we're going to click on the vulnerabilities here, and let me make this bigger. So what we're going to do is we're going to just take a peek at this, and this new version of Nessus actually starts grouping these together. Let's go ahead and hit settings and disable groups, and that'll show us by severity. So look what's coming back up. OpenSSL, unsupported. Let's check it out. 0.9.6b, 1.1.0, and it's saying, according to the banner, the remote server is running OpenSSL. And it doesn't tell us much about it. We'd actually have to do a little bit of research, click into this, see why this is such a bad thing, but this is absolutely out of date. Okay, so if we're making a screenshot here, we're gonna say, hey, this is out of date. We see this installed version. It's recommended to patch to this version. So if you're taking notes, you can go ahead and add that into your notes for your vulnerabilities. This is insufficient patching. Come back through here. It says even OpenSSH has remote privilege escalation. It's got remote overflows. So it looks like you could possibly perform an overflow against SSH. So if you did some research and you were able to find a vulnerability with that, that's cool. And we come through here and you see the Apache has denial of service, cross-site scripting. Again, Apache looks like insufficient patching, and mod SSL shows up. OpenSSL shows up, and I mean, we've just got vulnerability after vulnerability. So we would write a lot of these up, and depending on the assessment and how the assessment was going, depends on the severity that we're going to write up. Now, if we find remote code execution, we get a lot of access to a client, and a client just lights up like a Christmas tree when it comes time to reviewing their scans, then a lot of these, we might report on a lot of these, and we might not report on a lot of the lows or a lot of the mediums. But if we're in the opposite situation where, we aren't finding a lot, but there's still stuff to report, then we might report on like, hey, OpenSSL is, it's out of date. And then we go to the next page and we find a low, and maybe there's like, okay, there's something in here that's related to SSL TLS. This one is an unsupported cipher. We might report that as well, just depending on the potential in how many vulnerabilities that there actually are. So as of right now, it looks like this box is pretty critical. But what we also do as penetration testers is we take all the results in front of us, and what we'll do is we'll come in and we'll download this Nessus file. We'll take that Nessus file, and there's tools out there to convert a Nessus file into an Excel document, and it makes it nice and pretty, and we'll hand that over to the client as well. And in the report, it'll say, hey, look, we've covered some of the vulnerabilities. There's no way for us to touch all of them because this is a timed assessment. We focused on the low-hanging fruit. We focused on what we could. So please do go look at your Nessus scan results and all the information that we provide to you because it's super important. So again, if we have a client like this where we're going to have remote code execution, we're going to have a lot of vulnerabilities, then these things just start to stack up. And this is what a Nessus result looks like. You can click into these, you can get more information and possibly even, details on how to exploit it and how to solve it as well. So there's useful links in here a lot of the times, and just they give you information, but you should always go out and verify. Never trust your vulnerability scanner. Just because it says, hey, we detected it, you should go out and look and find it. Just like we had that screenshot from before with the Apache service version, we know this exists. We wouldn't provide a screenshot of the output of Nessus. We would go provide a screenshot that says, hey, we actually proved that we know it's there and you're out of date. So hopefully that gives you an idea of what we're doing with Nessus and why we're using it and how it could be an advantage to us. Sometimes we're so overwhelmed with everything around us that we might miss some vulnerabilities. And it's nice to just have a scanner detect a lot of vulnerabilities just for us. And it gives us something to look through, something to verify, double check, etc. It's just an extra layer of vulnerability assessment for us. It's a friend in the game. So I own 2 programs as a pen tester, 2 programs that I pay for. Nessus license is one, Burp Suite Pro is the other. So that's it for this section. Now we're going to move on to exploitation, really start to get into the fun stuff, talk about some different exploitation techniques you're going to see, and then we'll do a bunch of box walkthroughs and get into exploit development, and it's about to get so fun. This is the fun part of the course. Up until this point, it's just been scanning, enumeration, learning about the process, and it's been 9 hours of course material so far, almost 8 hours of course material, just to get to this point. That's how important I think that information gathering and scanning enumeration are, along with the foundations and the materials. You need to know all that before you can just start exploiting machines. So now we're there. Congratulations, pat yourself on the back. We're almost halfway through the exploitation part of this course. So once we get to the middle of the course capstone, I think it's going to be really fun and exciting. So that's it. End of spiel. I'll see you over in the next section when we start learning exploitation. Before we could start the cool exploitation phase, we have to first define a couple things. So we're going to quickly define different shell types we're going to see, and then we're going to define different types of payloads we're going to see. So let's first start with the shells. The most common shell you're going to see is what is called a reverse shell. Now in this example, it is using a tool called Netcat, which you're going to see here shortly. And a shell, all a shell is access to a machine. So when we say we pop a shell, that means we get access to a machine. Now a reverse shell means that a victim connects to us. Here you see it says target connecting to attack box, and you may get asked this question about shells in an interview. What is a reverse shell? What is a bind shell? So a reverse shell means, again, a victim connects to us. You see that it says target is connecting, attack box is listening. So what's happening here is that on the attack box, you can see that we have Netcat. This is NC, and we're just listening on a port here. LVP means listening verbose port. So we're listening on port 4444. That means on our machine, we're opening up that port when we use Netcat. On this machine, it's going to say, hey, Netcat, I want to connect to this IP address here. I want to connect to it on port 4444. And when I do that, I'm going to establish this bin shell here. So I'm going to execute bin shell, which is a Linux machine. If this was Windows, then it would be command.exe. So what we're going to do is we're going to say, hey, let's connect over here, and this is going to connect. So all we're going to do with the reverse shell is we're going to listen. Now, with the bind shell, a little bit different. We have our attack box and then our target. So with the bind shell, we actually open up a port on the machine, then we connect to it. So we fire off an exploit, that exploit goes in and it opens up a port, and then it's listening for us to connect. When we connect on that specific port to that specific machine with Netcat, then we're going to go ahead and get that shell, and on this side, it's going to execute for us that bin sh. Now, if we go back, same thing here. We're going to send some sort of exploit that's going to talk back and say, hey, I want to, when you exploit this, go ahead and just connect to 4444 on this machine. Now, this is going to come together very clearly when we get into our exploit development part here in just a little bit. But all you need to know right now is that a reverse shell means the target connects back to us. A bind shell means we connect to the target. Now, a little bit more about reverse shells. You're going to use reverse shells 95% of the time. There are instances where you're going to use bind shells. Bind shells most likely are going to be on an external assessment. If you think about it, a reverse shell, you're sitting in your home network and you are sitting on a VM, and that VM is using an internal IP address. It's talking out through NAT. It's going through your public IP address and you're attacking a target. Well, how are you going to connect that public IP address of the target back to yourself on an internal IP? You're going to have to set a port forward or a port trigger on your firewall to talk into that specific machine. It's a little bit of extra work. You're opening some stuff up on your side. The other idea is to say, hey, bind shell, why don't I just go ahead and open a port up on that target? I'll NAT my way through on my public IP address and I'll just connect to that port. It doesn't care what IP address you're coming from. You see, it's just listening. So we can come from any IP address and connect to that port on that machine. So this is where bind shells are useful when we have to bypass some sort of firewall, or it just makes sense. Sometimes a reverse shell just doesn't work and we have to use a bind shell anyway. So we have to think about the connection and how it's getting to and from us. Most of the time, especially because you're going to practice a lot in labs and you're going to do internal assessments as well, most of your shells are going to come in the form of reverse shell. However, bind shells do exist and you should know what they are as well. And again, for an interview, you should know the difference. So before we finish here, let's go ahead and take a look at what these look like. And I'm going to log back into my machine. And I've got two things open here. I've got 1 and 2. We're going to play victim and we're going to play target, right? Or attacker. So on the attacker, if we have a reverse shell, we're just going to say netcat, I want to listen. And I like to do NVLP, but you can do LVP as well, VLP. It doesn't matter what order. I just do the NVLP and all fours. So now we're listening on any, on all fours, right? So here we're going to say, on the victim screen, we're going to say, hey, netcat, I want to connect, and this is a self connection, but still, I want to connect to the victim machine, or I want to connect to my attacker from the victim machine. And our attacker's IP address is 139. They've got 4444 open. Let's establish that connection. And we're going to offer them bin bash when we do. And here's that connection. So this is a reverse shell. We were listening as the attacker, and then the victim connected to us, and then we could say something like, who am I? And you could see root, and then hostname, Cali, and we have a connection, and we offered up that bin bash here, so that works. So that is an example of a reverse shell. So I'm going to control C this connection, kill it, it dies over here. Now, let's say we wanted to flip the script and we want a bind shell. Well, now, guess who needs to be listening? Now in this instance, we're going to be listening and we're going to be offering up the bin bash because we are the victim. Okay, so we still have to offer up whatever command line we are going to have here. Now, all we have to do as the attacker is connect to our victim, and we have the same connection. You see the connection happens here. Who am I? Root, hostname, Cali. So That is the difference between a bind shell and a reverse shell. Remember, reverse shells are most commonly used, but bind shells are important. Again, just to hammer it home, reverse shell means a victim connects to us. Bind shell means we connect to a victim. So I'll catch you over in the next video when we talk about staged versus non-staged payloads. Now let's talk about staged versus non-staged payloads. And before we do that, we must talk about a payload. So a payload is what we're going to run as an exploit. And when we run that exploit, it's called a payload. We use different types of payloads depending on what it is. So you might see a Windows type payload or a Linux type payload, or as you see on the screen, interpreter type payload. There's Python. There's all different types. There's like 500 and something that we saw in Metasploit alone. And these payloads are what we use to send to a victim and attempt to get a shell on the machine. Now, it's going to make more sense as we go. It's okay if you're still a little bit confused on all of this. There are two main types of payloads that we need to pay attention to. There is what we call non-staged and what we call staged. Now, a non-staged payload sends the exploit shellcode all at once, where a staged payload sends it in stages. The non-staged payload is larger in size and it doesn't always work, where the staged payload can actually be less stable. So each has its con. And we have an example of it. And this is really what I want to point out is we have this non-staged payload and we have a staged payload. And do you see the one difference between the two? All it is a /. So when we see these and we're using something like Metasploit, and we have to pick out a payload, if we see something like meterpreter _reverse _TCP, this identifies that this is a non-staged payload. We can ignore the windows here. But here where we see meterpreter /reverse _TCP, this means we have a staged payload. What's happening? It's saying, hey, stage 1, stage 2. What's happening here? It's saying, hey, let's send this all at once. So this is going to become very important very quick, as we will attempt an exploit here very soon and it's not going to work. And then we're going to change the payload and it's going to work beautifully. So understand that what the takeaway is, if you have a payload that does not work, maybe try the other type of that payload. If you see something like reverse TCP, which is a reverse shell, by the way, over a TCP connection, if you say, hey, I'm going to send this staged reverse TCP, it's not working. All right, let me try to send a non-staged reverse TCP. Okay, that's not working, but I'm sure my exploit's right. So maybe I send a bind shell instead of a reverse shell here, and I'll send a bind shell staged and then non-staged. And we just keep trying until we find a payload that works. Not every payload is the right payload, and we have to find the one that works for us. So the takeaways: remember the /, remember the slight differences between non-stage and stage, and remember, if your payload fails but you think it's the right exploit, maybe change your payload. So we'll see that here very shortly as we start to get into exploitation in the next few videos. Whew, I am excited. And let me tell you how excited I am. This is not the first time I've recorded this video. This is actually the second time recording this video, because the first time I forgot to hit the record button. So now it's blinking red right in front of me, guaranteed recording, and I'm still as excited. Even the second time walking through this, I'm still as excited because this is what we've been building up for. This is everything we've been doing, the scanning, the enumeration, even the Linux and the Python. This is all building up to this. And now we're ready to exploit. We're going to get our first shell. We're going to pop our first shell today, and I'm so excited for both of us. So what we're going to do is we're going to run Metasploit for this one. And Metasploit's a little bit automated, but that's okay. In the next video, we're going to go ahead and cover it manually. So what we're going to do is we're going to attack SMB here. And with SMB, what we're going to do is, if you don't remember, search exploit Samba 2.2. We found Samba 2.2.1a. We searched around, we went out to the interwebs, we did search exploit, And we kept seeing this trans to open show up, like here and here, 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 all down here, right? Repeatedly. And it meets the criteria. Everything seems to make sense. It had that IPC anonymous connection as well. So I think this is a winner. And we're going to go ahead and give it a try. So I'm going to copy this, and we're just going to go ahead and type in MSF console and load up Metasploit. Once Metasploit loads, we're going to go ahead and just search for this guy and see if we can't find it. Now we know it exists because we did find that handy dandy Rapid7 website that said it did. So we're going to search it here. And we're given 4 options. Now, these are all operating systems here, but we have been good enumerators and good investigators, researchers, information gatherers, etc. We could have willy-nilly just saw 139, said, hey, I'm going to try to find exploits against it, and never looked at any other ports, but that's not us. We went out to port 80, we saw that it was running Red Hat, we discovered Linux on the machine, so we know we're going to pick the Linux module. So we're going to say use 1 as that corresponds to this module here. And then we're going to type in options. And all we have to do is set a rhost. So remember, rhost stands for remote host, or the victim that we're attacking. So we're going to say set rhost and 192.168.57134. And we're going to say options one more time, make sure that that actually set in there, and it did. Now, one thing I like to do is type in show targets. Now, there are no targets here, but as you're going to see later on in the course, there are often targets that we have to pick from. Not always is the first choice that's auto-selected right for us, but in this instance, there's only one choice, so it's the right choice. So now we have 2 options. Both are going to do the same thing for us. We could type in run, or we could type in exploit if we want to be cool. I want to be cool. Let's type in exploit. So we're going to run this, and it's going to start this brute force attack here, and it's going to start opening shells and closing shells. What is going on? So let's Control C. If yours is doing this, go ahead and Control C, interrupt this. Let's talk about what's happening. So you see it's trying this brute force attack. It's trying different return addresses here, and finally it lands on one that works, and it says, hey, I'm going to send this stage. This is always a good sign, by the way, sending the stage. Then it says, hey, I've got this Meterpreter session open because our payload has worked, and then this Meterpreter session closed. Reason died. That's not good. So it keeps going through over and over and over and over, and it's just dying. What is going on? Well, we've talked about this. Let's go into options again. Now, you don't see this the first time you do it, but you see it the second time because Metasploit says, hey, if your payload's not working, maybe the payload's the issue. And I'm going to give you payload options this time around. Now we see payload options here in the middle. That wasn't there before. We can see that we're running Linux x86 Meterpreter /reverse_TCP. What does that mean? Well, that means that we are running a staged payload. Couple other things to note while we're in here. We see lhost. That is the opposite of rhost. Lhost is us. We are the listening host. So we sit here and we have our IP address. Sometimes this auto selects correctly, sometimes it doesn't. In this case, it did. And then we have the L port, which is by default all 4s. So that's fine for now. It's fine for these lessons. When you get into actually running this in the wild, all 4s is probably going to get you picked up pretty quick because this is a default Meterpreter port. So if some connection sees or some antivirus or detection software sees 4444 open up, this is going to trigger an alarm here. But anyway, for this course, you're not going to need to worry about it too much. Right now, we're going to go ahead and set a payload. We're going to say set payload. And how do we know what payload to pick? Let's just start typing out Linux and hit tab. And it auto tabs out the x86 part for us. And then let's just hit double tab. All right, now with double tab, that's great. Look at the payload options we have. We got a bunch. Now, we've got a bunch of Meterpreters, but unfortunately, they're all staged payloads here. I love a good Meterpreter shell, and you guys will understand why as we move forward. But as of right now, it doesn't look like we're going to be able to use one. If we come over to this right column here, you can see that we've got other shells as well, And we come down, and finally down here, we've got a few options that are non-staged. So let's go ahead and try this shell reverse underscore TCP right here. And you can just start typing that out. And that should auto tab complete for you. Go ahead and hit enter. Hit options one more time to make sure that this actually works. You can see here that it actually picked up. And now let's go ahead and try to run this. And let's see if it happens. Fingers crossed. Hey, look at that. So we've got a shell now. And it says command shell session open 5. Let's try, who am I? Root, hostname, Captrix level 1. We have successfully rooted this machine. Root is the commander of the system. We cannot go any deeper than this. We own this machine. Hands down, it's our machine. So congratulations. You have made it this far. This is your first rooted machine. You should be very proud. Pat yourself on the back. You're awesome. So from here, we're going to go ahead and we're going to focus on port 80 and 443 and how we can exploit those manually. And then we'll move on to some other exploitation techniques. But for now, congratulate yourself. You have your first shell. I'm very excited for you. So I'll catch you over in the next video as we start some manual exploitation. So we have gained root with Metasploit, but now we need to gain root with some manual exploitation. So remember earlier, we discovered that we had an exploit with our mod SSL, and we're going to see what we could do about it. So we went to Google and we researched mod SSL, and we came up with something called Open Luck, if you remember that. So we clicked on this Open Luck here, and this is the same as the one that is out there on exploit database, but it is fixed. So remember, the exploit database one is broken, so we'd rather use this one that is fixed. So what we're going to do is we're going to follow the instructions here. And this is very well laid out. So it tells you to git clone this, we need to do an install of an SSL dev library, we need to compile, and then run the exploit. So very, very straightforward. We're going to go ahead and do exactly what it says. And let's go ahead and just copy this first line here. And I'm going to just make this a little smaller, go into a terminal. And I actually have a folder for Captrix. I'm going to cd into it. And then we're going to go ahead and just paste that line. And it will git clone everything. If we ls, now we see that it is there. So let's cd into that folder, the bad word folder, and we'll ls. And now you can see that there is just the C file here in the README. So what we're going to do is we need to install this libssl dev. So we're going to say apt install and then libssl-dev like this, hit enter, and then just hit enter because it says yes already. This will take just a second to install. And then once it does this, we're going to use a tool, looks like, called GCC, which GCC is a compiler. So if you've never used C or are familiar with C, we have a C file, but this isn't ready to use. We have to compile that C file in order to actually use it. So that's what we're doing here, is we're downloading a little bit of stuff to actually be able to compile that. GCC is built in, and we just needed some other things additionally. So now what we're going to do is we're going to say GCC, and typically you say -o for the output, so we can call it whatever we want. We'll just call this open, and then we'll just specify the file. You can start typing it and then tab out. And then it says this L crypto, which is important. Hit enter, okay, and then hit ls. And you see now in pretty green lighting up and saying, hey, we're executable. We have our executable, right? We have our script that we can run. So we could say /open and run it. And you can see in here all the different options that this runs against. So you remember when it was brute forcing, the last one, when we saw the trans to open was kind of doing a brute force. In theory, this is what it could do as well, but here we actually have to pick a return address based on our machine. So we're going to look at the usage. I always like to do the application without any usage to see what the usage is. And we need to use target box, which is one of these down here. We need to select a port. Maybe it says for SSL connection, we're not going to be using an SSL connection, so don't worry about that. And then a -C number. And it says use range 40 to 50 if you don't know. So our syntax is going to look something like ./open, one of these offsets that we're going to pick, and then it's going to be a -C, probably 40, with the box IP address in between. So how do we find what we're looking for? Well, I'm going to cheat just a little bit and tell you guys to scroll down, 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 down. And if we look at 6B here, remember, we were up against Apache 1.3.20. See, enumeration comes into play big time. So Apache 1.3.20. Now there are two we can run against. I'm picking this one. I believe it's the more stable one. So we could pick either one, but I would choose B. I think A doesn't work all the time. So let's choose B here. And Apache 1.3.20 is the indicator. And again, Red Hat Linux, so that's another indicator. So let's copy this so we don't forget it. And we're just going to scroll down and we're going to say, hey, ./open, and we're going to paste that 0x6b. And then we're going to run this against the IP address because it said box was next. So 134. And then remember we had to give a -C of 40. So that is the syntax. Sometimes you have to follow along, and it's I don't think most of them are as confusing as this. I wouldn't say this is confusing. I would just say it's pretty lengthy for a exploit because you have to go through all the different offsets here to find the offset and actually fire this off. But you know, you have the opportunity here to actually be able to read usage and just understand your way through it. So once you get this little syntax and all this part down, it's really not that bad. So to check off the list, we've got the target, we've got the box IP address. We don't need the port because we're not running against SSL. We're just going to run this against port 80, and then we're going to run -C of 40. So let's go ahead and try to fire that off and see what happens here. And this may just take a second. Okay, it says it's spawning a shell. Now we wait for the SUID. Let's scroll up just a little bit while we're waiting here to see. So it looks like it sent the shell code and it spawned a shell. And it says, hey, we have no job control in this shell. And then it has a shell here, bash 2.05. That is a shell. And then it's going in and it's doing some wgets. Now, if this is able to get out to the internet, it's going to go ahead and try to do wgets against these. It's going to keep downloading and it's going to get the response here. Okay. And now it says we wait for the shell because it saved this .c file here. And let's see if maybe we already have a shell. Who am I? Root. Look at that. So it looks like it downloaded something and allowed us to maybe privilege escalate here. And let's say host name. Okay. So we've gone through and we've rooted this machine with Metasploit, and now we've gone through and rooted this machine with the manually downloaded exploit. So there's two options. You're going to find out that Metasploit is a more robust and popular option, especially as a penetration tester. Now, there is a common misconception or thought process put out there by certifications. The OSCP, for example, doesn't let you use a lot of Metasploit, only one instance of Metasploit on their exam. So everybody thinks, man, I really shouldn't use Metasploit. But you're going to see in this course how useful it really is and how robust it is. And if you talk to a penetration tester, they're going to use the best tools available to them. The certifications out there that do that are just making it harder to pass the exam intentionally than they are, for practicality. This course is all about practicality. So from here, now that we've exploited it manually, let's talk about a couple things that we look for in post. So post being post exploitation, and we're going to cover this over and over and over again. We're not going to get into it fully right now. I just want to give you an idea as to the thought process. So the first thing to think about is, what is our IP address? We could say ifconfig if it'll allow us to. It depends on what kind of shell we're in. And see, this one is a weird shell. We could try IPA. It's still not going to be found. If we try some commands like arp or route, I doubt they're going to be found right now either. But we want to look at like the routing table, the arp table. We want to see if this machine is what's called dual homed. And you're going to learn more about that when we get into the pivoting. But if this has like two NICs, and we're on one network and the NIC is on a second network that we never saw before, then maybe we can do something called pivoting and move into that new network. But we would be able to identify who the machine's talking to with an ARP table or a route. We could also look at like sudo privileges. So we could say something like sudo-l, but we're root, so we can run as everybody. So if a sudo user, as we talked about in Linux lessons, sudo user is able to run commands as elevated, but here as root, we're obviously already elevated. So other things that we can do, we can cat what's called the etc password file. Now this is very misleading because the etc password file used to be the password file. Now it just holds a placeholder. So you could see all the users that are on this computer, root being this one. There's a lot of built-in users here. But if you always scroll down to the bottom and you start at the 500s, that's where your users start. So there's actually two users on this computer as well. One's named John, the other's named Harold. So we look at these users and we say, okay, well, there's no password in this password file, but there used to be. Back in the day, there used to be. That's why they call it this. And now they moved it to this placeholder of an X. And what we can do is we can come in here and we can say, hey, cat etc shadow. And now you see the hashes are in here. So these hashes are what the X is placeholding for. We can actually combine both of these files with the tool and go offline and try to crack these. We'll work on that later on in the course. But just for now, like getting your wheels spinning on as to what we can do with root level access. We need to start enumerating again, looking at files on the computer, seeing what's out there and what we can do with it. But we'll get into post-exploitation techniques and thought process as we go through the Active Directory portion of the course, because I think it plays hand in hand. And we can talk about password cracking there and how to attack some of this stuff. But there will be a password cracking video on Linux as well when we get into the post-exploitation phase of this. But that's really it for now. So we've got the shadow. We could take this offline, try to crack it. We can enumerate files. We can try to, break into user folders and see what they've got in there. Maybe they've got password files stored in there, etc. So from here, we have rooted this machine twice. We've rooted it with Metasploit, we rooted it manually, and now we can start moving on. I do want to show you a few more attacks. So here's what's going to happen over the next few videos. We're going to talk about brute force attacks really quick on SSH. We're going to talk about credential stuffing. We're going to revisit that concept that we talked about in information gathering. And then we're going to look at our notes. And we're just going to compare notes and see where we're at with findings and everything else. After that, we're going to get into what I like to call the mid-course capstone, which is going to allow us to do a bunch of exploitation against a bunch of machines, and it should be really fun. So, end of spiel again. I will catch you over in the next video as we talk about brute force attacks. In a previous video, we discussed SSH and that it's really not always that much of a low-hanging fruit. So we've got SSH here, and say we want to attack it. Now there are 3 reasons we're going to do this, and this is from a realistic perspective. If we see SSH on an assessment, we're going to try to brute force against it or use weak or default credentials. And we're going to do that because 1, we're going to test password strength. 2, we're going to see if we can get in with a weak password or default password. And if we can, that also attests to password strength, correct? And 3, we're going to see how well the blue team performs